resume recording. I'd like to welcome everyone to this NGAA policy discussion webinar on housing affordability. I know there are a number of people who will be joining us in the next couple of minutes. We are recording this session, so if you miss the start or if you can't join us live, then we'll be distributing this recording, hopefully maybe even later today or certainly by the end of the week. So welcome to everyone. Especially like to welcome our two guest speakers, Georgia Allen, a housing consultant from ID, the population experts, and Ben Nicholson, a senior project manager from the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, helpfully shortened to NIFIC. And what we'll do today is first we'll hear from Georgia to talk about some great work that ID is doing on measuring and identifying housing, affordable housing, and how local government can report that. And we'll also then hear from Ben about a grant and loan scheme that can unlock affordable housing sites in outer suburban areas. So after that, I'll give you a quick update on what we're doing at NGAA on this issue and some research that we've been involved in. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end for just a little wrap up and say, where do we go from here? What would be useful for our members to know from here? How can we connect you with the right people? So what I would do is, if you have questions during the sessions, during the presentations, use the chat feature, which you should see, I think, down the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring those questions, so feel free to send them in at any time, and at the end of each presentation we'll have some time to run through those questions. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Georgia Allen. I'm just going to run her slides. So I think, Georgia, you can find the green share screen button for when you're ready to speak. So thank you, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Excellent. Thanks, Bronwen, and thanks to the NGAA for giving ID the opportunity to speak with you all today. So just a quick overview of what I'll cover in the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to have a little bit of a chat about what we've heard in consultation with local councils, especially the growth areas in regards to housing and the struggles they have there. And also share with you a framework we've developed to help you structure a housing report. So lots of this work you can undertake yourself, and we'll share some pointers on how you can get yourselves up and running. We'll share where you can find some of the data in public resources, a few tips and tricks to consider when you're looking at housing stress, and also where you can get access to this step-by-step guide. So as Bronwen said, my name's Georgia. I'm a consultant at ID. I work in the housing team. So we're a small team. We specialise in housing and consulting services for local governments. Lots of you might know us from Profile ID or Forecast ID. So we work with those same people, just with a more housing bent. So we look at evidence bases for housing policies, strategic planning, and other community engagement and advocacy activities. So what have we heard from councils? This is a behind the scenes photo of a board summarising the themes from our consultation process. We've spoken to a number of councils, including Whittlesea, one of your growth area members. We've heard about pain, such as the time it takes to find and collate and analyse data, disappearing data sources, and changing state government guidelines and requests. We've heard about gains, or things that people would really like to be able to do, such as have more localised data or be able to monitor their data more regularly. And things we've heard that you guys in local councils have to do range from having to put together your housing strategies and precinct plans to evaluating these strategies and liaising with a wide range of stakeholders and having to be able to communicate some of these more complicated topics to a wide range of audiences. And these insights help us form the basis of our consulting work, but also a new tool that we've recently developed called Housing ID. So rather than take notes, for today's session, we've looked after that for you. So you can download this guide from our website. We can send out these slides and you'll be able to get the link. It'll take you through the framework I'm going to take you through today. If you're wondering why we're sort of giving away these pointers for free, it's not a free version of our full housing offering, but it does share the same framework, which is something we heard people found really hard. How do I approach housing or writing a housing report in the first place? So this is a really good base to get you started. So where can you find some of the data I'm going to chat about shortly? The NGAA subscribes to Profile ID, so they have a profile that covers all of the growth areas across Australia, and so you can get some of the data for your LGA through that site. But the vast majority of you also subscribe to your own Profile ID sites, which will give you that local suburb level data, which will be really important, and I'll share why soon. Many of you also subscribe to Forecast ID, which is our population forecast product, and that will give you some insights into the future population and housing needs in your area. So the framework's relatively simple. We break it down into 4 main parts. So firstly, population and households, which is the demographic or demand story of your area. Housing and approvals, which looks at the story from a physical stock or supply angle. And thirdly, prices and incomes, the economic factors at play for your housing story. And fourthly, probably the one that's of most interest for people today is affordability and availability, which brings together the data and the insights from the previous 3 sections and looks at how they're going to affect your local population and the implications for future housing provision. So firstly, population and households. In this section, we'd identify what demographers would call the role and function of your place. The first piece of data that's really important to look at is your total population numbers. So most generally, we suggest using your ERP, which you can find on your profile site. Not only can you get this data at your LGA level, but you can also get it for your suburbs and precincts. And I'm going to stress some of the small area data for the growth areas today. It's particularly important for people working in your context because you do have significant differences between your suburbs. So if we take Whittlesea, for example, you've got some of your more established suburbs, you know, around Thomastown, but then you've also got some greenfield areas. And the way that you would plan and deliver housing in these areas is quite different. We've recently worked with Casey and they've almost titled their report A Tale of Two Cities because it is almost such a dichotomy between the two. Next, it's a really good idea to look at your age profile and look at the age structure of your population. Generally, we do this in 5-year age groups, but you could use the service age population on profile. It starts to give you an idea about the types of households that you might see living in your area. And in growth areas, generally, we do see a lot of young children and adults, which unsurprisingly, when you move on to the next piece, looking at your household types, you are going to see a lot of couples with young children. And you can also, on Profile ID, there's some tabs at the top of those pages there that show you the life stages, so you can understand if you've got couples with young children or couples with teenagers, and again that's going to have implications on the types of housing they may need. Understanding the household types living in your area is important because it does have implications for the types of dwellings that they'll need, and we'll have a little look at that in a moment. Housing tenure is also really important, especially as it gives you some insights into the socio-economic status, as well as the role your area plays in the wider housing market. It's a great lead metric in regards to housing affordability. So across most of our capital cities, we've seen significant increases in the number of renters. And this is suggesting that affordability of house purchase is becoming more and more unaffordable. And the last piece of the story I want to touch on is looking at housing consumption patterns. So this is some data that's available in our new tool, Housing ID, or you can also get access to it through ABS Table Builder if you've got someone with those skills. So what it looks at is by different household types, what types of dwellings are they living in? So obviously this is an example for Whittlesea. And there's sort of a bit of a chicken and egg story here, because obviously you've got most of your household types are living in separate dwellings. That may be their preference, but it's also a reflection of the dwelling stock that is supplied in the area. So it's really interesting to understand and see how your patterns compare to the regional averages as well. So secondly, housing and approvals. In this section of the framework, we look at the physical dwellings being supplied in your housing market. Firstly, looking at the dwelling types. So by this we mean if they're separate houses, townhouses. Sometimes we put townhouses and small apartments together as a medium density category. But it's a really important determinant of an area's residential role and function, and can help you identify supply gaps that you might have in your market. This is especially the case if you look at it in conjunction with number of bedrooms. So perhaps you're seeing in growth areas, something we see is less small dwelling types, so less of the medium density or 2-3 bedroom type houses, and so that has implications such as limiting older residents' opportunities to downsize, or even more affordable supply for your lower income households. And looking at change in these data sets is also really important, just to understand what types of development is occurring in your area and at what rate for those different types. The third point there is your future dwelling. So if you subscribe to Forecast ID, you can have a look at the forecast growth in dwellings and also some of the assumptions we've made behind that. So there's a tab there. If anyone needs some assistance, just get in touch on this side of things. But you can have a look at the assumptions, and we name out whole developments or actual buildings, and we tell you the number of dwellings we're assuming there. And that's all data that we've come up with in conjunction with your strategic planners as well. And the other thing that can be really interesting to do, and something we do on our new tool Housing ID, is map building approvals by SA1. So that's the smallest ABS geography we get access to. So it's roughly 150 households. So it's really particularly useful if you're wanting to understand where development is occurring, or perhaps you're wanting to evaluate a previous strategy. So some councils have a strategy of wanting to direct all of their development into activity centre areas, and so being able to see exactly where your building approvals are occurring can help you evaluate whether you've been successful there or not. So the next part of the framework is to have a look at the economic side of housing, so incomes and housing costs. The best way to look at incomes in this situation is to look at the income quartiles. This gives you a good idea about whether you've got low or high income households in your area. And it's also probably the best and really the only way you can look at income change in a truly comparable way, because it does take out some of the complicated economic factors like inflation. Another option for looking at the incomes, especially for anyone listening in from New South Wales or Victoria, is to have a look at the new income brackets that are being used in Victoria's context, the Planning and Environment Act, or the ones that families and communities use in New South Wales. Unfortunately, this is pretty tricky data to be able to pull together yourself. You can get custom orders from the ABS, or we can provide it through Housing ID, or I know that families and communities in New South Wales also provide that data to councils as well. The next part of this section is to look at your housing costs. So how much does it actually cost to buy a home in the area? How much does it cost to rent a home? Both of these can be found on Economy ID if your council subscribes, or there are, of course, a fair few open source data sources that you can look at. So I'm thinking Valuer Generals in Melbourne, or some of the DHHS data. And I know that Sydney also have a sort of a tableau dashboard where you can have a look at house prices as well. The data that we use here at ID is provided by HomeTrack. So that's the data arm of realestate.com.au, a site that probably lots of us are quite familiar with. And something we're doing in Housing ID to help our councils monitor and keep track of house prices in this period of flux, of decrease and then sudden increases again, is to update this data every 6 months, so you can get a very accurate and very timely picture of just what the pricing points within your market are. Something we're also able to do is to give you the house prices for your custom small areas that you use on Profile ID. So that gives you a little bit of a more local nuance on the data. And at this point in the report, it's something we really suggest for councils to do is to, at this point, put together a chart looking at the change in incomes and the change in housing costs over a certain period of time. It's a really engaging chart. It's something everyone's seen from, you know, say the RBA or on a news report, and it really does grab people's attention. So finally, how can you put together an evidence base for affordability and availability of affordable housing in your market? So this is a more difficult one to do yourself, but here are some approaches that you can take. Firstly, we recommend looking at housing stress, and there's 2 ways that you can do this. Firstly, there's the NatSem definition, which looks at the bottom 40% of income earners spending more than 30% on their housing costs. The other possible definition is to use those income bands I mentioned before in Victoria and New South Wales, and then have a look at the people in those bands spending more than 30% on their housing costs. You can find the NatSem definition on Atlas, which will be attached to your profile site. And you can use the map selector. We can show you both rental and mortgage stress, and that does give you some very fine-grained information, again at the SA1 level. The second definition, so using those very low and moderate income bands, can be found on Housing ID or some state government sources as well. So let's have a look at how you would use that second definition. So this is an example of mortgage stress in Whittlesea. And you can see that by using these income bands, you do get a little bit of a greater detail about which income groups are being affected by mortgage stress. And another benefit of using this definition is understanding mortgage stress and rental stress for moderate income households. And these households are particularly important, especially in growth areas, as they include some of your key workers that help service your population. So your nurses and your school teachers, people that you would generally want to have living in your local areas. Another piece of analysis that can really bolster an affordability study includes looking at how much households of different income levels can safely spend on a house purchase or weekly rent, without going over that 30% threshold. And so then having a look at how many are provided at that level. So for an example, in the Greater Melbourne context, a low-income household can afford to spend $395,000 on a house purchase. And yes, I think we probably all know there are not too many of those. But over the last 12 months in the city of Whittlesea, 7.2% of sales would have been affordable to a household on this income level. So we are seeing that the growth areas are doing a little bit more of the heavy lifting in terms of providing affordable housing. So 7.2%, while it doesn't sound very good, is actually quite high in the Greater Melbourne context. We work with areas such as Moonee Valley and Bayside, obviously the Brighton area, where we're seeing less than 2% of sales being affordable for that income group. And while I've touched on mortgages in this example here, it's also really important to do this same analysis for renters, obviously the most vulnerable group within our housing market, because once you can't afford a private rental or find a private rental, there are not too many other options for you without going into crisis housing while you wait for your public housing approval. And then there's one last thing, that if you'd like to take this analysis further, or perhaps you're working on a social or affordable housing strategy or action plan, you might want to look at trying to quantify the number of social and affordable dwellings required in your area. This can be done using a concept and methodology called Affordable Housing Need, which was developed by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute in 2018. It's a pretty complex process. I don't have time to go into it today, unfortunately, but it could be an entire webinar on its own. But if anyone's interested in learning more, please get in touch with us after the webinar, or get in touch with Bronwen and let us know in the questions box if you would like to learn more. So that brings me to the end of my part of today's webinar. I hope I've helped shed some light on where you can find some evidence to help your housing strategies and your advocacy efforts. So as I said, there's a written guide to help you access this data and put the pieces together. So jump onto our website and you should be able to find a copy. Thank you, Bronwen, and thanks NGAA for providing me with the opportunity to chat with everyone today. Thanks.
Thanks, Georgia. That was great. Thank you very much. I'll open up to questions and see if you wanted to perhaps put your hand up, or I can or send in a question through the chat mechanism and I can put them in. What sort of impact do you think this work is having, Georgia? So what sort of scope are you looking at, and how's it working?
Yeah, I think it's been really useful for our councils, especially the growth areas, because as I was saying, you do have those two sometimes very different stories to explain, and being able to explain them clearly is really important. And the other thing is being able to use the data to advocate back to state government. I know in working with Whittlesea, so when we calculated for them the number of affordable dwellings that they would need going forwards and the types of households that would need them. So in Whittlesea, a lot of families need affordable housing, but the state government are always looking at putting in smaller, like 1 and 2 bedroom units. That data's given them the power to be able to say, that's actually not going to work for our area, we need something different. So it gives them the strength to be able to say those things, even though they might anecdotally know it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a question about when the local government data for the forecast future developments was last updated.
So that will differ for each council. So it's almost like a little consulting project that we do. So if that particular person wants to get in touch, I can check with our forecasters the last time that was updated for them.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I'm sure everyone's going to be clicking on that link, Georgia, and having a having a look at all of the detail. And we will be sending out the slides as well, so people can go directly there. But all right, I don't see any more questions coming through for now. I think you've given us such a comprehensive overview. So what we might do is, if you'll obviously stay on the line with us, and we might go to Ben. So Ben Nicholson from the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation is going to tell us about a particular funding facility that they have available, and it's one of those things that's quite new. I've spoken to Ben a couple of times about this, and we just thought it would be really useful to give some examples of how it's being used, because it's one of those things that can be a bit hard to sort of see how you're going to apply it locally. So what I'll do is I'll share the slides, and Ben, I'll hand over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bronwen, and thank you, Kelly.
There we go.
All right. So I might just introduce NIFIC and myself. So NIFIC was established around 18 months ago as a corporate Commonwealth entity, and our mission was dedicated to improving housing outcomes for all Australians, but with a particular focus on affordable and social housing. Now, my role there is as a senior project manager in the origination team, and my focus has largely been around infrastructure facility, which I'll talk to more today. So just wouldn't mind changing the slides. Fantastic, thank you. So NIFIC administer a few products, and we've had a couple products introduced just this year. So we have the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator, and the key focus for the bond aggregator is to provide long-term, lower cost finance to community housing providers to enable them to grow their books and grow their property portfolios. We also have the infrastructure facility, which I'll be speaking to today. And then we've recently brought on the First Home Lenders Deposit Scheme, which is a 5 to 20% government guarantee. And then we are also developing the team for a federal research function, which will advise on housing policy. So just in terms of the National Housing Infrastructure and what it is, maybe just wouldn't mind changing the slides or forward one slide. Fantastic. Oh, two more. Fantastic. So it's $1 billion permanent fund, and it's eligible. It's available for a number of different proponents, and we can speak to eligibility later. But it provides finance both through a grant and a loan for infrastructure projects, including sort of services, transport, and remediation, to unlock housing supply. Now, it can be quite a little difficult concept to understand. So what it is effectively we look at sites with councils, with state governments, with community housing providers that may be quite costly to enable development on those sites. And so what we're able to do is we can both grant fund and concessional fund, generally coupled, the development of those enabling works. So our policy was sort of put in place towards the middle of last year, and we had our first NIF approved project towards the end of last year, around September. And that was a project in WA, which we can speak to later in this presentation. Sorry, next slide, Bronwen. Fantastic. So from an eligibility standpoint, so firstly, councils are eligible. So any local governing body is eligible to access the NIF funds. And then there are two other eligibility requirements. The first of which is the scope, as I spoke to earlier. So that is for new or upgraded services infrastructure, such as your stormwater, sewer, high voltage, comms infrastructure, and then you also have transport infrastructure. And so that may be connecting roads or signalised intersections. And then there is also remediation works. There is a third eligibility criteria for the NIF, and that is the additionality requirement. And so what that may entail is one of three options. The first of which is a go, no go, which would just be that by making available NIF funds, the project is now feasible. The second of which would be a bring forward. So the project might have a start date in 2030, but with availability of NIF funds, that can be brought to 2025. And the third of which is the availability of additional housing outcomes. And what that may be is, without NIFIC funds, there was a yield of 200 lots on that development site. And with NIFIC funds, we're able to increase that to 220, 250. So next slide, please. Fantastic. So beyond the availability of a grant, we do have a number of other benefits to the NIF funding. And so when we get to the case study, we can talk to sort of what the blend may look like from grant to loan. But in terms of the actual loan portion of it, we can offer a longer loan tenor than the commercial financiers can. We can go up to 7 years. We can also look at lower interest rates. So our starting point is actually the commercial rate, and then we're able to work down from there. So as I understand, councils are eligible to T Corp funding. And so what we'll look to do is to achieve rates close to that. And then once we tie in the grant funding, we're obviously available, or you'll be subject to lower rate. What we're also able to look at is periods of interest capitalisation or deferred payments. So each NIF facility will be quite flexible, and so we've got the ability to tailor the facility to the requirements of the council, and then that's obviously in addition to the grants. If you just mind flicking through. Fantastic. So in terms of the eligibility, so councils by themselves are eligible. So generally it will be in the form of a special purpose vehicle, or and that's only as a council in of itself is not a trading corporation. So once the SPV is formed and once additionality can be proved, i.e. the project coming online or units brought forward or increased, we'll look at the scope. So in terms of what scope we can fund, we're working with councils at the moment on projects like bridges, so pedestrian bridges to access sites which were previously landlocked. We're looking at major sewer treatment plant upgrades, again, to enable new development sites to happen. We're looking at HV undergrounding, again, to allow projects to happen. And then there are a number of projects at the earlier stages where they've been sort of stuck in, pre-DA stage due to the cost of remediation. And so we're looking with a number of councils again, and also other partners like state governments and community housing providers to examine what we can do with those sites to get them site ready and to enable future development. Might want to just jump to the next slide. So this is, I guess, where I wanted to potentially focus a little bit of time on the case study. So this is the project that has board approval, and we're actually working with the state government on this particular site, but we could treat this as, this could have been a council, this could have been a CHP. So it was a site that had fantastic accessibility to the city, and it was a site that had sat dormant for quite some time. And that was largely around its previous use as a quarry. And so the state government got in touch with NIFIC, and we worked through both the EOI and application process with them to fund up to $15 million for the facility, with around 30% of that grant funded. And what that did is that enabled the project to be brought forward. So the state government was reliant on funds from the state, and those funds weren't available at the time, but they'd be appropriated down the track. NIFIC was able to step in and provide those funds to enable that project to be brought forward. And we had a very high mix of social and affordable housing on that site, which was largely driven by the state ownership and then obviously the cheap source of debt. Now, the intent with that site is to have community housing providers take ownership of a number of those social and affordable rental products, and that debt will be provided to those CHPs, again through NIFIC in the form of a bond aggregator. So all in all, there was around 1,500 dwellings that were enabled through that site. It may be worthwhile asking some questions, because this is generally where I get the questions. It's a bit harder in this format to have people sort of throw their hands up. Were there any questions on this case study or how it could be applied to councils?
Ben, I think, the thing that stands out that I've heard from some of our members is the availability of concessional loans from other providers. But the standout difference here is the grant component. So what are some other ideas? I know, you're just in early stages of discussions with some other groups perhaps. What's sort of got them across the line to think that this facility is the way to go forward?
Yeah, great question, Bronwen. So obviously the grant component is generally the one that gets picked up earliest by councils. Having that grant availability to support the projects has generally been the first discussion topic. What level of grant funding can we get? Can it be 100% grant funded? Is generally the second question that we get from councils. And so, the discussions to date have been it's a permanent fund, the infrastructure facility, and we're a Commonwealth entity. So the intent is that we will make those funds available to as many councils as we can. Now, I guess the benefit of being in contact with NIFIC sooner rather than later is the expectation is we want to get these funds out the door. We want to ensure that we're supporting, a healthy pipeline of affordable social and housing projects in general. And so we've been providing, I guess, a little bit more flexibility in the NIF as we roll out this process. And so, yeah, we've discussions with councils have been around the grant availability, and then also the concessions that we can offer, so we can capitalise that interest for the loan until such time as the projects are generating revenue. And that may be, for as an example, for a sewer treatment plant, if you're looking at a $10 million sewer treatment plant or sewer treatment plant upgrade to enable a housing development site, it could mean a $3 million grant, and then that $7 million loan could be interest capitalised until such time as infrastructure contributions can make their way back to councils, or council can fund those works. And that can be up to 7 years.
Yeah, it feels like, it's a long process to go through, and it's so that extended time frame is a really positive thing as well. Yeah,
absolutely. It may be worthwhile speaking to, just while I've got a little bit of time left, the process for applying for NIF funds. So I will make my information available following this session, but just in terms of the process. So we have a two-stage application process. The first stage is an EOI, and that's largely just to examine the 3 criterion for eligibility, which is the proponent. So in the case of a council, they will be eligible. And then we'll look at the scope, so whether or not that scope will be eligible, and then the additionality. And that actually gets taken right up the line, and we will provide a form of comfort or a letter of support for that project. And then we go through a formal application process, and that'll be the time to which we will sort of lock those funds away to ensure that they're made available to the councils for their projects for a period of time.
Okay. Do you want to just run through the rest of your slides, Ben? Or
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully you weren't all scribbling all this information down. We do have quite a bit of information available on our website, which is nhfic.gov.au. And when we distribute the PowerPoint, I'll see if we can also distribute a couple of fact sheets. So one of which takes you through the steps in applying for the NIF finance and what it can be used for. And the other is for our AHBA loans, which are only available to community housing providers, but it can be there as a source of interest to councils. And then I believe it's questions is the next slide. Yeah.
So maybe I'll put it out to people listening in if anyone has looked into this facility already. I'll put my video. So yeah, I'd love to know a bit more about if growth areas have been looking at this, and how far they've got in the process, and what may have been a barrier to them going forward, or is it still early days and people are still trying to conceptualise how this could work with their strategic planning?
Happy to leave it open in the group. I might step through a couple of the issues that we've had to date with councils, because I think that's quite important to understand.
Yeah, good.
What are the roadblocks? And so the first of which is probably the SPV. And so NIFIC are able to lend only to trading corporations, and then also to the state government under Section 51. But for the councils, so this ability to form an SPV, some will be very familiar with the process, some potentially not so much. I'd assume a lot of the NGAA councils would probably be a little bit more familiar, a bit more educated to the process. That's probably the first step. The second is the accounting standards, so how the debt is treated on the council's books, specifically if the councils are entering into joint ventures with private developers. So NIFIC can accept or can fund joint ventures between council, SPVs and private parties. and that may be in the form of, say, the private parties or landowner. The council is keen to see that site developed and participate in order to have those works funded through NIF. And so as part of the other, as another concession, NIFIC are able to potentially look at a higher level of market risk than the commercial lenders. So we can take on, say, lower levels of pre-sales. So yeah, things to think about would be the formation of that SPV and the accounting standards for, you know, if the councils can take or can have this debt on their books.
Yeah. So there's probably some of those internal discussions to have in councils to, you know, I think we've got some community planners online, we've got some researchers and some strategic planners. So it's probably that first step is having the group conversation in council to see
absolutely
where this would fit. And I'm assuming, Ben, you know, you and your team would be happy to take a call to just explore the issues and see. Absolutely.
Obviously today we've, you know, 10 minutes to scratch the surface of the NIF. It is, you know, quite a complex beast, so it would be worthwhile having a discussion with councils that were interested. It doesn't hurt to have a 10 or 15 minute conversation about the project. So I'll ensure I leave all my details with you, Bronwen.
Yeah, thanks. And so I know that you've had some interest from a number of councils. So just to sort of let people know, you've got one across the board, but there's quite a few that you're having discussions with to see.
Yeah, correct. So we obviously haven't been running, the NIF hasn't been the key focus for NIFIC up until sort of probably the last 6 months. And so we do now have, we've got a number of active applications. We have a number of active EOIs, both with council, state governments and JVs. And so we do have the only one project which has been board approved and will be utilised in the not too distant future.
Okay. Great. It's a good start.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, thanks very much for that, Ben. And yeah, I really hope that we can get some of those discussions happening and see if we can tie all of these things together, because obviously, you know, it's the work that Georgia, the findings that Georgia can show that will influence a council's planning around housing provision, and then they can come to you to bring that story to life, I suppose. So, so thank you very much. What we'll do now is move on. I'm just going to give a quick update on some research that we've been involved in with AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Let me just get that slide working properly. But a couple of things I wanted to run through. I just wanted to make sure everyone has seen an AHURI brief that came out in January called "What Role Can Local Government Play in Delivering Affordable Housing?" It's a real Kickstarter, gets a good introduction if there's some people on your team who are new to this sort of concept. So it talks about direct action and indirect action, and it's quite a you know, a good starting point if you need to talk to other people in your council about this type of issue. It focuses on those key workers. So who are those people in those lower income demographics that are essential to our economy and that probably face some housing affordability issues and end up perhaps under mortgage stress or unable to find suitable rental accommodation. So this is where I think a lot of our councils are working. They're looking at this inclusionary zoning and voluntary planning agreements, and this is where we're helping. So we're looking at the advocacy role to say what are the policy settings that are missing? What's stopping people from all income demographics and quintiles or quartiles being able to access housing relatively close to where they live? And I just thought this number down the bottom was quite startling. So that's, you know, in 16 years' time, there's nearly 750 million social housing dwellings that will be required. So there's a big task ahead. So I'd recommend a visit to the AHURI website for anyone listening in. I'm sure you're all across it already. One of our NGAA's research partnerships has been to be part of an inquiry, an AHURI inquiry, which was about urban productivity and affordable rental housing supply. Now, it's due to be released sometime early this year, so I'm not sure exactly when that will be, but we've been involved in a few panel hearings and contributed that perspective from growth areas. So the piece itself is pulls together 4 separate research streams, and it's being led by Professor Nicole, who I think some of our members have come across before. Jago Dodson from RMIT is another one working on one of these individual pieces of research. So what they're trying to do is show the connections between urban productivity, availability of affordable rental housing, and they are focusing on rental housing in this one, and then looking at where the jobs are and what the commute times are, what's the connection, what's the connectivity. So it's really quite an interesting and complex puzzle to try and put together. So the study looks at, they're looking at quintile 2 income households. So that is 36 to 65 per annum. It's the entire household's income from wages, and they decided to look at this quintile because that's where a lot of those essential services workers fall. And they're also agreed that people on incomes below 36,000 per annum would be less likely to be in the workforce. So they're really looking at those essential workers and where they need to live. The aims were about looking from the big picture. So what are the strategic policy interventions? Now, part of that might be looking at city deals or planning schedules, planning structures. What are the other aspects, what are the other incentives needed to get housing at the right price near to where workers live? So those major employment centres, whether it's hospitals, childcare centres or other major employers, where do their employees live and how can we make sure there's a connection and a proximity? And so part of that is looking from the other side as well, how do we move jobs out to where essential workers live? And predominantly that is in growth areas. So I think it's a really, you know, it's going to be a really interesting outcome, and I think we'll be able to use a lot of it from an NGAA perspective to show that importance of, for national productivity as well as our local economies, how important it is to connect affordable housing with employment centres. How we do that, how we achieve that agglomeration, we need the right policy mechanisms to be able to do that. So that's where we come in, I suppose. I'm disappointed that the report wasn't finished yet, but I think it's going to be so interesting when it is done that I'd like to make sure we can share it, whether it's through our research symposium that will be happening in May, early May in Liverpool this year, or whether it is through another webinar or at our Congress. So I think, you know, that sort of study pulls together a lot of what NGAA looks at. And I think it'll be fantastic when it's finalised. So that was just a very quick update on the research that we've been involved in. I will, you know, forward some links to the AHURI sites that would be interesting. But in terms of moving on now to say what do we do from here? So housing does come up a number of times in our policy platform, And if any of you haven't looked at our policy platform for this year, I'd really recommend you have a look on and download it from the advocacy page of our website. It was developed in late 2018 and followed a lot of consultation with all of our members, and we're now in this great process of just an annual update, a review and update of all of these policies that we advocate for. This is what we stand for, and we review it based on what's changed for our members, what's changed in the political environment, what's changed nationally and internationally that we need to be aware of. So our 4 pillars are here: rebalancing Australian capital cities, investing in places for people, unlocking economic growth, and prioritising transport solutions. And they all have a role to play in connecting people and their houses to their jobs. So the main thing that we're looking at the moment is under the first pillar, rebalancing Australian capital cities. So this is about really needing to reimagine the spatial structure of our capital cities to make sure that we can sort of let go of that obsession with the CBD and really shift the focus to where people live. So the things that we're pursuing through our advocacy this year will be around integrating strategic planning, really having a look, perhaps, you know, hopefully even through the COAG process, how do we reform those responsibilities that are shared between the 3 levels of government? Obviously, we can't change it all, it's constitutional, but how can we make sure that they work well together? Because we do have, you know, this sort of pressing need to solve this affordable housing issue. We'll also be advocating for a place-based approach to development, which includes infrastructure sequencing, so making sure we're building and developing places that are great places to live, as well as for businesses to invest and create jobs. We're also making sure that the city deal process continues to evolve and can be the mechanism through which we can address some of these issues. The second pillar that is relevant is our invest in places for people, and people, everyone who came to our Congress last year knows that that was our focus around creating places and spaces for people in growth areas. We also needed to invest in places for people and businesses, but this is the sort of thing that we'll be advocating for, which is, oh, sorry, I've clicked once too often, which is around really improving our own within local government and our connections with state government to improve place-based urban planning and design, to make sure that if we're investing in transport hubs, then they become employment centres and have high density and medium density housing as well. So we're really looking at those things that we can try and advocate for change. Underneath that, sitting at the next level underneath, for example, in our submission to the federal government for the budget submission, a number of different projects that our councils have highlighted to say, look, here's one that's sort of ready to go. We just need a bit of investment. So that's a very quick overview of what we're doing here at NGAA. Happy to open the floor to any questions. We've only got sort of a minute or a couple of minutes left, but I'd love to hear, and perhaps just by phone call or email, I'd love to hear from those members about what you're doing in this space. How could we assist? How could we connect you with others, whether it's Georgia or Ben or other member councils in the NGAA who might be able to provide some assistance or some ideas, or just share ideas of what you're doing. So just quickly check if there are any questions coming through or comments. Don't really see anyone there. So this has just been a bit of a download of information. So I'm sure everyone's loved spending their lunch hour doing that. But so I will wrap it up then. I don't see any questions coming in, but as I said, we will circulate the slides and the recording of this. And I'd really like it to be the start of a conversation. So please do make sure that you get in touch with us if you'd like to pursue any of this further, if you'd like to contribute further to our policy platform. There's lots that we can do together, but I think the most important thing is learning where each other's at and where the opportunities are. So formally I'd like to thank Georgia and Ben. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks especially to ID, who were great, have been great support for us. Well, since I've been around, I know that much. With some great research and sponsoring us at our Congress and coming over to do that as well. You're absolutely great resource. And Ben, I really think we're getting closer to connecting growth area councils with not just those concessional loans, but importantly the grant funding to unlock housing supply. So thank you both very much, and we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Bronwen.
Okay, thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.